So, hello everyone. I am Kelly. This is Uncorked History with the new tagline that I'm trying out. What did I say? Where history and alcohol meet and form sparkling conversation, or
I love
something
it.
like that.
Great.
So, thank you all for joining us on a special night, a Wednesday this week. As I think we will all learn, the next few weeks is going to all be about changing gears, changing plans at the last second, over and over again. So we're on a special night. Hi, Jamie, and thank you for joining me on a special night.
Yeah. I actually like this a little bit better this week just because Christmas is like it's creeping up on me and I still have like wrapping to do and stockings to stuff and I'm
We
a little
haven't put our
behind.
tree up, so.
Well, welcome everyone. Tonight we are joined by two very special guests. We have Dr. Rebecca Gibson, who has a PhD in anthropology, right? Awesome. And then we have Conor Gallagher, who is a winemaker for Songhill Winery. So welcome, you guys.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Thank you very much.
And I just realized I've known Conor for 25 years. That makes us pretty old, Conor. So I could ask some pretty embarrassing questions, but I won't.
That cuts both ways, Kelly.
That's very true. Okay. We've got a peace treaty here. We're not gonna lob those grenades. So I think we should start by asking everyone what you are drinking. So Rebecca, you told us you've got some pretty alcoholic cocktails. So what are you drinking?
Yes. So I went and saw The Matrix Resurrections today, and I have made a blue pill and a red pill.
Brilliant.
Thank you. They're both vodka based. They're unfortunately both raspberry flavored. I was going to do this one just straight lemonade, but to get the blue, apparently it's blue raspberry. I'm anticipating it being awful. And this is raspberry puree that I actually made myself earlier this morning and rose syrup. Yeah.
Very nice. Conor, are you drinking your own wine?
I am. I pulled this one, which I think Kelly, you just got. This is I don't know if it's backwards on there, if it's but it's Diamond, which is a hybrid grape that was developed in the 1880s, right in our area. And this vintage is the first vintage from our own grapes. So I thought that would be kind of cool. But I also have my wine fridge behind me, so if I need to move to something else.
The diamond wine is delicious. It is very good. All right, Jamie, what are you drinking?
I couldn't get Songhill out here for whatever reason, Virginia and their crazy distribution ABC laws, but I am drinking hot apple cider with rum. So quite
very nice. I think of rum when I think of you because of the pirate connection. All right, and I am drinking, and Conor, I'm going to ask you about this. So this is Songhill wine. I am, as Conor just referenced, on the subscription plan, whatever you call it. So I get a lot of Songhill wine, and this is ice wine. Oh, you can't see it. You're never going to be able to see that. But anyway, it's ice wine. It comes in this cute little bottle, and so I am drinking that tonight, and I'm going to ask Conor about it. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but maybe just to sort of introduce our audience to both of you, if you could tell us a little bit about just kind of how you got into what you do. So Rebecca, you have very interesting fields of study. I would love to hear a little bit about just how you got into that kind of research.
Sure. So I, at some point along the way, decided to stop making decisions about my research interests based on what would benefit my career and just do all of the things that I wanted to do. My PhD is in biological anthropology, specifically what skeletons do to the, or rather what corsets do to the skeletons. I swear I've only had 2 sips. What corsets do to the skeletons of the women who wore them. And so that was my dissertation, and I turned that into my second book. But really, at heart, I'm extremely eclectic as a scholar. And so my first book, and hopefully book number 6, will be examinations of science fiction. So I look at Blade Runner and its impact on robotics, specifically robot sex. And then I look, or rather I will be looking at the Matrix franchise for book number 6. Books number 3 and 4 are examinations of gender and the supernatural and the liminality of death. And I got into all of these things just because they're so fascinating. Like, why would you not want to know more about them? Why would you not want to do more about them? I love all sorts of things, the books that I've read, the movies that I've watched that I want to keep analyzing. I would love to go back to the Bones, of course. That's my first love. Bones are very quiet and peaceful and comforting to me. But, we're not out of this pandemic yet, and all of the museums are closed. So
I thought being a pirate historian was cool, but being able to say that you are a corset and robot sex scholar, I think you've taken the cake there.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's oddly enough, I never really went into this to be controversial or to push the envelope on any of this stuff. I just like what I like, and I want to talk to people about it.
Very cool. So, Conor, we went to college together, and I remember you drinking wine. I don't remember you studying wine in college. And of course, you couldn't have because our school did not offer such things. So, how and when did you get from, I think you were doing like paralegal stuff to being a winemaker?
Yeah, I think at baseline heavily influenced by studying abroad. I did the summer abroad of right between freshman and sophomore year in Italy, and just how they sort of married the wine with the food, like the whole culture, the whole agriculture, the farm to table aspect of it. And then my first jobs out of college, so I changed my major to Italian, which really was difficult getting jobs, but I ended up getting a job as a corporate paralegal. And I did that for 11 years. But about halfway through that, I kind of realized I was working at a law firm in Chicago, and the hours were awful. And and there wasn't much of a light at the end of the tunnel. The partners were there more than I was, and I was sleeping in my office sometimes. And so I was actually talking with my mom at one point, and I was like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Like, I don't know. I thought I was going to go to law school, but I was like, it just doesn't seem to be for me. And so she's like, all right, clean slate, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, I like agriculture, I like wine, and I like fishing. And she's like, well, good luck with that. And but I started looking into programs to go back to the University of California. Davis had a online program for winemaking. And the first thing I did was I reached out to a bunch of, I looked at, there was a job platform that Wine Business Monthly had posted. And I just emailed a bunch of places who were looking for like assistant winemakers. And I said, I'm not applying for this job, but if I had this certificate program from the UC Davis, would you consider me as a candidate? And of the, I don't know, dozen or so emails I sent out, 2 got back to me. One of them said, that's the degree that I have. So yeah, I would definitely. So it's like, all right, this could work. And so I enrolled in that program, and I started, well, they required you to take biochemistry classes. So I basically went back to school again to learn winemaking, and then got a job in Chicago at Wild Blossom Winery, Meadery, Brewery on the south side of Chicago. And then I ended up getting a job out here as an assistant winemaker in the Finger Lakes before kind of taking over my grandparents' farm. So.
That is so cool. Every time I'm like, my job's really hard. What would I want to, like, I don't have that dream, that like thing I would want to do. So I think it's very cool that you sort of had that dream and went for it.
Oh my God,
with your lovely wife.
Yeah.
Biochemistry would have eliminated me.
What's that?
Biochemistry would have eliminated me.
Yeah, I didn't. I mean, I was a liberal arts major, so I didn't have my last chemistry class was high school, and I needed a bit of hand holding getting through that for sure. So, but it pays off now, and it paid off in my first shop. There's a lot of sort of self-taught or kind of familial winemakers, and there's a difference, I think, when you have sort of the academic background knowledge. One of the job that I got out here, the winemaker there was sort of self-taught and in apprenticeships, but he didn't have the background. And there were times where I was like, well, hey, what if we do this? And because he didn't really know the chemistry. So it definitely, it's helped me in a lot of ways. But I came out with it was like zero practical knowledge, like I didn't have the hands-on. I didn't know what a triclover valve was or how to connect a must pump, any of that stuff. It was like, I was as green as you could be. So.
Yeah, I would have a lot of trouble with the chemistry part. Although I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology, so I understand the not knowing what you want to do. Like I did the archaeological dig as part of my degree, and I herniated 3 discs in my back. So I was like, that's not gonna work. So I just kind of bounced around through different degrees until I landed at the PhD in history.
I totally get that, because that was very much, in a way, my background as well. I took all of the classes because I wanted to do all of the things. And then during my PhD, I got diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which made a lot of sense based on a lot of symptoms. And it basically, unfortunately, meant that I could never dig again. So no standard archaeology for me, but I get that.
Yeah.
So
That's
I want to
really-
ask. Oh, I want to ask about the ice wine, Conor. So tell us what ice wine is. It's very good, but what is it? Why does it come in the little bottle? Like what is this? Because other than, like if you hadn't sent it to me, I would have no idea that it even existed.
Yeah, it's so it kind of, like a lot of things like champagne and other things, kind of came about by accident. My understanding is that sometime I think in the 60s or 70s in Germany, they had a very early heavy freeze, like in September or something like that. And they decided, instead of just wiping out the harvest, that they were going to harvest these grapes and just kind of try and process them normally. But so the traditional way of making ice wine, because there's a way to fake it where people harvest in October, throw them in a freezer, and then press the grapes. But that you can call it like iced wine with a D, or ice style wine, but you can't call it ice wine. True ice wine, you let the vines hang until you get you let the grapes hang on the vine until you get 3 consecutive days where the high temperature doesn't get above 18 degrees Fahrenheit. And what happens is all the water in the grapes freezes. And so then you harvest the grapes. So when we did that one, I think it was January 16th, they started harvesting at 10 o'clock at night. We had 3 consecutive days, and they harvested from 10 o'clock at night till 10 a.m. the next morning. I got the grapes at noon. And then, so I had my barn like wide open. It was 14 degrees was the high outside. The warmest it got in my barn was 19. And we put the whole grapes into the press. And they when they hang out on the vine like that, they undergo these physiological changes that you don't get if you harvest it in October and then just throw it in a freezer. One of the detriments is you get a lot of loss. Like the grapes themselves, they shrivel up, they dehydrate. You've got temperature swings throughout the day, so they're expanding and contracting, and they're respiring a lot. So you're losing a lot of your volume. So for example, the batch of grapes that we harvested, if we had harvested in October, it would have brought in about 2,500 pounds. When we harvested in January, it brought in 1,600 pounds. So we lost about 900 pounds of volume right there. Then the second thing you're doing is you're leaving any of that residual water behind, and you're really gently pressing the grapes while they're all frozen. That's why my barn was never got any warmer than 19. and it comes out of the press like maple syrup. It comes out really slow. It just trickles out. So I was pressing from noon till about 2 in the morning. My father and brother came to help. My dad tucked it out around 8, and my brother tucked it out around 11. But I was there till 2 in the morning, pressing. And so it's very high sugar when it comes in, so high that the yeast can't fully ferment it all. The alcohol gets too toxic at a certain point, usually around like 15 or 16%. It kills the yeast off. We don't let that happen. So there's one of the crazy things about it is that you can't just throw winemaking yeast on it right away because of the vines hanging out there and those physiological changes that happen. The fructose to glucose ratios get kind of way out of whack. And standard winemaking yeast don't like that environment. So if you take a winemaking yeast and you throw it on there right away, it's going to spit off a lot of off aromas, kind of like nail polish remover, hydrogen sulfide. And, so you don't want that. So we actually inoculate it first with the species that we do is Saccharomyces. So it's a non-Saccharomyces species. It's a non-winemaking grape. And the reason it's not, or yeast, I mean, the reason it's not a winemaking yeast is because the alcohol is toxic to it at about 4%. So it could never finish a fermentation. But we put that on there, we let it get going for a couple of days and start fermentation, and it gets those ratios kind of back toward what we like. And then we put the winemaking yeast on, and then you've got to cut it off early. One of the things I did with mine, the standard residual sugar on average for ice wine is about 15 to 18%, which is incredibly high. It's really very, very sweet. You kind of drink it as a cordial. And I tend to like my wine, almost all of my wine is on the drier side. So I tend to like my wine drier. So I was shooting for about 15% residual sugar. I was trying to go toward the drier end. This being the first time that I did it, I talked with a lot of winemakers around the region, hey, am I doing this right? Like, this is kind of scary and, doing something for the first time. But they kind of guided me through, but they're like, yeah, you're going to have to shut fermentation off early. Because if you let it go all the way to the point where you're at 15, 16% alcohol, the yeast will start kicking off aromas before they die. And you don't want that. So you want to shut them down. So we hit them with some sulfite. We throw them back out into the cold to get them to shut down. And then in March, you as soon as it warms up, you rack them off of the yeast sediment through a filter to keep all the yeast sediment behind so that it won't restart fermentation again. But I didn't know that just because you hit sulfite and throw it out into the cold, it doesn't like stop right away. So I tried to shut it off. And these are kind of approximates because as fermentation is going, there's a lot of carbon dioxide being kicked off. It's kind of an active live fermentation. And those temperatures are kind of creating almost a current in your tank. So your sampling is not 100% accurate. I thought it would stop at 15%. It didn't stop. It took a couple of days to stop. So we're at about 12 to 13% residual sugar on that ice wine. But actually, I kind of like it a little better because I tend to like it on the drier side because I feel like it can get too sickly sweet. But that's basically the reason. Like, it's a very labor-intensive process. That's why we bottle it only in a 375 milliliters instead of a standard 750 milliliter bottle because it's more expensive to produce, and because it's so sweet and kind of rich in flavor, you get these when you make real traditional ice wine, it gets these sort of marmalade type flavors to it that are very unique to it. But you don't want to you don't drink a whole lot. You're not like pouring a huge glass of it like you would with a big red wine. So that's why it's we put it in smaller bottles. And also why it's like crazy expensive because you're getting like a tenth of the volume as you would if you had just harvested in October and made a standard white wine out of it. So,
well, this seems like something that should be used as a plug for people who think like climate change isn't real. We should be like, we're not going to be able to make ice wine anymore.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you say that. So our region, the Finger Lakes region, we're considered a cool climate region, and we are. But we can't make ice wine here every year. We've never really been able to. We've never really been like. There's some years where you're just not quite cold enough. I'm glad I didn't try it in 2020 because I don't think we had a stretch of 3 days where the high temperature was below 18 last winter. And I know that they were very worried about it. And so the Ontario Escarpment of Canada is really like your premier. I think they're the biggest, even bigger than Germany and some areas in Austria where they started making ice wine. I think that that region of Canada is the biggest. And I had read in some trade journals that they did the smallest ice wine harvest, because you got to predict, you got to decide what grapes you're going to let hang out there and shrivel up, and what grapes you're going to harvest ripe. And they left the smallest amount of grapes out there for ice wine this past winter because they were very concerned it was going to be too mild for them to make a lot of traditional ice wine. So yeah, that is one of the issues that we deal with on a regular basis.
And I thought reading 17th century handwriting was complicated. Like, that sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah, I don't know. It's not part of my regular portfolio. I'm glad I did it. I had the opportunity with a grower at the Cornell University who said, hey, I've got these grapes that are great for it. And so I was like, yeah, let me try it the one time. But it was brutal. I mean, I woke up, that day of pressing from noon till 2 in the morning, I woke up the next day and I wasn't drinking while I was working, and I felt hungover and like I had played a football game. But I had to get up and get the ferment warmed up. You got to get it warmed up right away. Otherwise, spoilage microorganisms will go nuts over that sugar. So it was rough. And I'm like, I don't know if I'll do it again, or maybe not for a few years.
Some experiences are a one-time thing.
Exactly.
So I have a question for you, Rebecca. Tell us a little bit about your book, The Corseted Skeleton, and kind of like the conclusions you came to and the types of evidence you used to draw those conclusions, because the name of the book itself is just fantastic, but it's also such an interesting read. So.
Oh, thank you. I'm always very touched when people actually like what I wrote. I like what I wrote, but I don't assume that anybody else is going to. So this is the book that started as my dissertation, and actually started back in my master's program when I started thinking about the assumptions that we have in terms of corseting. I was just getting into corseting myself. It is also very helpful for some of the symptoms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And it actually started both as a fashion trend among people in the 1600s, and also with a medical side to it, where you could tighten the garments and give support to the back and the ribs and everything. So I was thinking about, the killer corset, and I was thinking about how women are portrayed as being both harmed by and dependent on their corset in the time periods where they regularly wore them. So I looked into this, and the people who were meant to be supporting me, my advisors, and the people who had other projects going like this, were not, unfortunately, very supportive. But I don't really enjoy being told no if there is no real reason to be told no. Like, if I can't figure out why I shouldn't be doing something, I tend to just do it. So I kept researching what I wanted to research and asking those particular questions. Why do we look at women this way? Where is the physical evidence for the way we look at the women who corseted? And, can I bust some of those myths? Can we talk about the killer corset and, give women back their own voices in terms of why they wore it, what happened when they did, what made this persist over 400 years. So first I wanted to look at the corsets themselves, and then I wanted to look at the skeletons also, because if you look at most of the books that are available other than mine, what you see is a picture of the corsets themselves. You see the dimensions of the corsets and what they're made of, and people who talk about the museum specimens that we have existing at the moment. you don't see a lot of the bodily evidence, a lot of the physical evidence, not even a lot of the evidence that was written up in medical journals, because sometimes it was just like, it was pushed to the wayside. It was a women's issue. Not very many people cared about it, even at the time, even though it was very contentious at the time. It was still one of those things that didn't get a lot of press. So I wanted to look at the skeletons. I figured if corsets had any type of effect, you would find it on the rib cage, you would find it on the spinal column, you would find it on the bodies of the women. And if we don't have the full body, we can at least look at the skeletons. So I went to London and Paris, mainly because French is my other language. You have to have another language for an anthropology PhD. And it's, that was the one that I spoke, and those particular museum archives were ones that were really accessible and available for me to look at, particularly because I had to self-fund. So a lot of my research was week-long or 2-week-long chunks done in a tearing hurry. And I found circular rib cages. This was so awesome. I'm going to put my drink down because I have to use my hands to talk about this. So the human body is wider than we are deep. This is what gives us our general appearance. And that is formed by our rib cage and to a lesser degree, our pelvis. And the ribs start at the spinal column and sort of go, excuse me, around and downward a bit to join into our sternal cartilage. And the ribs themselves form a sort of lopsided C shape. So if you have a C, this is the hard part, trying to get my hands to do what they're meant to do. If you have a C and it is not perfectly straight, this is not a good rib. A good rib is more like this. It's a lopsided C. It's more of a curved in and downward. What I'm finding in the skeletons is a perfect C, making a perfectly round rib cage. Not completely round in all of the women that I looked at, but much, much closer to round than it should be. My rib cage is something like, 30 centimeters wide by about 20-ish deep. And I'm finding rib cages in these women where they were 17 by 17.5, almost perfect circles. So what you see here is deformation over time. Just like when we use orthodontic braces to correct the shape of the dental arch, women were using, we're using corsets to form the skeleton into a more culturally desirable shape. They didn't go in with the idea to change the skeleton. They did go in with the idea to change the shape of the woman. The skeletal deformation was kind of incidental. And so that was part of it. Like, yes, there is this impact, but what can this impact say about the lives of the women in the corset? We hear these things through popular culture, through the literature of the day, where people would talk about it in magazines and stuff. We hear that the corset is a killer, that women are in pain because of it, that they're fainting because of it, that they're being cut in half, or their livers are being cut in half, or they're dying because of the corset. So I, for the corseted skeleton, went through, again, going back to that problem of deciphering handwriting, I went through the archival records for the parish where my skeletons came from. And that particular cemetery was open from 1770 to 1849. And during that time, 3,815 women died there. And none of them died from the corset. It was nowhere in those records. So no corseting damage was reported. No broken ribs were reported as cause of death, no bisected liver, nothing that we hear about in popular culture was reported for this time period at that cemetery. What also wasn't reported is the other picture that we have of these women, that they died young. We hear that the average age of death was in the 30s, based on, multiple childbirths and wearing themselves out with housework and all of this stuff that makes it sound like being a woman back then was just, short, painful, and subservient. What I found, though, was that if you made it past the age of 30 in my particular sample of women, you were much more likely to live to 60, 70, 80, 90 years old. They weren't dying in mass as young women. They were dying as grandmothers. I saw generations of people in this particular archive. And it was just fascinating to look at, because we formed these ideas of what people's lives were like in the past. And sometimes those ideas have, kernels of truth, but so many people very rarely look back and give people back their nuance. We don't think of all women today as behaving a certain way, or at least we don't if we're, trying to be accurate about things, if we're not being misogynistic about things. But we look back at the past and we see women in servitude to their corsets, and that's just not what I found. And thankfully, I have an even bigger chance to rebut that coming in 2023. Book number 5 is going to be a translation of a French textbook written in 1908. And the textbook is called The Corset. And it is a body system by body system breakdown of what this particular doctor thinks that the corset did to the body. Well, he wasn't that great of a doctor, and he isn't that great at supporting what he writes with evidence, and he's leaning on everybody from other doctors from the time period to, of all people, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I didn't know had written about the corset, but apparently he did. And he's also deeply misogynistic and deeply racist. So it would be very interesting. I'm in the process now. I have a copy of the book. It's actually a relatively rare book, even though it's relatively well known. But I have a physical copy of the book. I have typed it all out into a clean copy of French, and I'm in the process of translating it. So a limited translation and annotation will be out with Bloomsbury's fashion history line in 2023, if all goes well.
That is fantastic. As somebody who wears a corset sometimes for costuming as a pirate, people would tell me all the time, they're like, don't wear that. You're going to shift your organs permanently. And I'm like, I don't think that's how the body works, but thank you.
Bodies are very squishy. Like,
They are very
even the joints, even, the bones rubbing up against each other in the joints can be distressingly squishy sometimes, particularly if you have a condition like mine where that is a problem that is exacerbated. But yeah, there's a ton of flexibility in the body. People go through more discomfort and bodily changes, permanent bodily changes, by going through pregnancy. And in fact,
I can attest to that.
Sorry. And in fact, a lot of the symptoms that he mentions can be attributed to other things, including pregnancy. He talks specifically about women who have had multiple pregnancies, and then he's like, but it was the corset. I'm like, really? It was the corset and not the 9 babies that made her uterus prolapse? Are you positive about this?
I have just a follow-up question on it. So did you find in your research, my wife's a labor and delivery nurse, so that's kind of, I get a lot of that information from her, but did you find in your research that the corset didn't really impact like childbirth and morbidity? I mean, were there like cultural things where it's like as soon as you're pregnant, you take the corset off? And you know, I don't know, they hide you from society or something. Just to follow up on that, what did you find? That's
So
fascinating.
that question is intensely complicated. There were pregnancy corsets. So there were corsets that you could expand as you grew bigger throughout the pregnancy. They made them with like multiple buttons down the front and multiple buttons on the straps. So you could literally just expand the corset. And in fact, having some sort of support, particularly if this was your second or third time having a child and the ligaments were stretched out or the skin was stretched out, you might want that additional support underneath, and they had corsets that would do that too. So that's part of it. The other part, though, is that the ability to wear the corset or not wear the corset was highly situational. One other thing we tend to think of when we think about women and corseting is we think that this is a rich person thing. This is definitely not a rich person thing. This is a person who goes out and does things in public thing, whether or not they were rich. So poorer women would be wearing corsets and they would need them to structure the garments that went over the corsets, and they might not be able to do without them during pregnancy. They might alter them though. A lot of women sew their own clothing, including their own corsets, so they might alter them and make them more comfortable during pregnancy. They might not take them off. And the practice of confinement, which you mentioned, the hiding away of the pregnant body, was also very much a socioeconomic class thing, or a how much can I get away with thing, because a lot of women at this time period, and I'm speaking specifically of London here, they had to make a living. We think of women at the time as being in the domestic sphere, in the house, but not all of them were. There were a lot of people below the poverty line in London at the time. So they would continue to wear them and continue to do their jobs right up until they delivered. The flip side of this, though, is something which I'm very, very much going to try to track down for this translation project, which is the idea of deliberately using corsets to cause injury to a fetus or even miscarriage. Now, we do hear about this. We hear about this both as accidents and we hear about it as being on purpose. There's a novella, I guess. It's longer than a short story, but it's not quite a novel, by Maupassant, called The Mother of Monsters, La Mère de la... I don't know what monsters is in French, but it's Mother of Monsters. And it is about this woman who over tightens her corset and delivers a deformed and disabled child. And she finds out that she can sell the child to a sideshow. And so instead of becoming a burden on her, this becomes a money-making opportunity. And she's used as sort of an object lesson by Maupassant, who apparently didn't like women either. And, she's the mother of monsters. She creates these deformities out of her body, out of a twisted maternal instinct, not a good maternal instinct. I have doubts about the validity of this particular practice, maybe not for early term miscarriages. It's certainly possible that if a woman knew her own body well enough and realized she was carrying and didn't want to, and didn't have additional legal means to procure an abortion for herself, keeping the corset pretty tight against the uterus might have worked. But again, this is medical hearsay. Like there's very few actual reports that I would trust. O'Fallowell himself, the man who I'm translating, draws a lot of his information from the famed physician Ambrose Paré. Ambrose Paré died in 1590. We're all the way up in 1908 here, and he's getting a lot of his medical info on corseting from a guy who died in 1590. So I'm going to try to track this one down because it's fascinating with what it says about how women were regarded then, and also how we're regarded now in terms of the debate on abortion, the debate on birth control, the right to keep our names when we get married or decide not to have, like, I will be 41 in a couple of months. I am glad I will no longer get questions about childbirth. Like, I chose not to, that should be that, but it never is. And it comes directly from this time period.
You know, I watch a lot of Murdoch mysteries. My mom is in the audience and she also loves Murdoch. There's an episode of Murdoch where they use a corset to kill someone. So yeah, and of course there are lots of episodes of murder mysteries where people are killed in wineries. Lots and lots. So Conor, I want to ask you some about the effects of the pandemic on, you know, sort of, because you're both wine industry, but you're also a small business, small family-owned business, farm, you know, and what we hear a lot about people drinking a lot in the pandemic, which I think is probably true. But you know, are there difficulties in getting wine to people, or getting wine made, getting wine to people, especially your business being mostly local and not as much in shipping? You know, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so just to touch on the shipping, and I know, like, I don't ship to Virginia, but I actually just found out I can ship to Washington. When they repealed the Volstead Act, which was prohibition, they basically said states can make whatever alcohol laws they want, essentially, and then the states do. So they vary from, like, Utah, which is a felony state, to a state like Virginia, where it's just cost prohibitive. The license is a couple $100 a year. So I'd have to sell a heck of a lot of wine to justify spending a couple $100 a year. To, like, North Carolina, where the license I think was free and I don't ever have to renew it. Or DC, which is, there's no licensing. It's DC's totally open. So if you know a UPS state, you know, that'll accept packages for customers, I can ship there in DC. And
I have a friend in DC that has received alcohol for me before, so
okay, yeah,
might
exactly.
do that.
It's but yeah, so there's sort of that aspect, and then it was kind of similar with the pandemic. So New York State decided that all the liquor stores were essential, which a lot of people laughed at. But my understanding was that the rationale behind it was that they didn't want alcoholics going through withdrawal or drinking mouthwash or, you know, whatever, and then ending up in emergency rooms when they were worried about emergency room space. I don't know how realistic that really was, but Pennsylvania did not. Pennsylvania closed them. So Pennsylvania is another state that has a very high, I think it's $300 a year for their license, and a lot of bureaucracy that goes along with it. So there's monthly filings and excise taxes and stuff. But the bigger wineries in the area who ship to Pennsylvania, they actually said they didn't do as much business as they would have if their tasting room were open, but they did okay. And especially, like, being able to let go of staff because you didn't have to staff a tasting room, they probably made out about the same because they shipped to Pennsylvania and people were just shipping it in. Me being a smaller, not having, like, you know, able to sustain that overhead, I was shut down from March. My tasting room's seasonal. So some of it was like, okay, I'll be all right. We were hoping to open up in April. And it was going to be 2020 was going to be my first full year of having the tasting room open because I had to get through a bunch of bureaucracy with the town. So even though I started selling in 2015, I didn't get my tasting room fully open to the public until July of 2019. So it was like a 4-year kind of legal bureaucratic battle. It was mostly a paperwork battle with the town, but my paralegal experience came in handy. But my hope was 2020, this is great. I'm going to be able to be open from, you know, spring all the way through the fall. And then we were shut down and then they extended it. And that was very scary for me because, you know, I don't really have, like, it's a small, tiny little family business. I didn't have like lots of capital to rely on. So I actually called all of my growers because I have, I can't produce, I don't have enough, the vines take 5 to 6 years to produce. So I don't have enough of my own grapes to make all of the wine that I need to make. So I contract with other growers, and I called them up in April and I said, I don't know what's going to happen. There's a chance that I won't be, if I can't sell anything out of my tasting room, there's a chance I'm not going to be able to afford to buy grapes from you this harvest. So I said, and you got to let them know as soon as possible, because growers secure these contracts for the grapes way ahead of time. So they were all very gracious about it. They said, no problem. I said, if you can find a guaranteed buyer, take it. And if things turn around, I'll call you back and beg for scraps. And that's basically what happened. So I did the smallest harvest I'd ever done in 2020. I did very little. I think I usually do about anywhere from 350 to 500 cases a year. And in 2020, I did about 125 cases. And so I'm starting to see that now, because it takes a couple of years before that wine's ready to sell. But when I did open up, because of the way our property was situated, we did great, because we've got a big open barn. I mean, the ceilings are over 10 feet high. There's lots of space and airflow, and then I had tons of outdoor seating. And the great thing about 2020 was it was unseasonably dry, and I wasn't rained out very often. So people could sit outside. They felt very safe and secure. And a lot of people were, by July 1st, when we opened, they were sort of dying to go somewhere that they felt safe, and we were able to provide that with lots of outdoor seating. They could sit at tables outside. They could all be socially distant. We had sort of 2 separate bars inside the barn, so people could come into the barn and be separate from each other. And that worked out really well. And then we were able to open up this year, right on schedule. I'm glad I wasn't open over the winter. And most of the wineries that I know who are typically open throughout the winter have a year-round tasting room. A lot of them closed down last year. They just and that's been sort of some of the problems sort of with the staffing with tasting rooms. It's like you let these people go, and then you got to try and bring them back in, and they're tentative about coming back in because how guaranteed is that job? So there's been some uncertainty. I mean, I'm very grateful that I'm closed down right now, even though it sucks financially that I don't, that I'm not open. I'm just open seasonally, and I got to try and concentrate all of my sales. But I know it's a real struggle with wineries right now, with sort of the 5th wave of things going on, and they're debating whether or not they should, New York State just reinstituted a mask policy, which we haven't had since I think of July. So that was a big deal. And I know that they're sort of debating, what do we do? Are we going to start requiring vaccinations at the door? And that's been very stressful for others. Right now, I'm just kind of waiting it out, and I'll see, in March when I open back up again, where things are, and just have to adapt accordingly. But all of us in the industry we've tried to be very adaptable. We want, and we're a hospitality industry. We rely on people coming, visiting our properties, visiting this beautiful scenery. The Finger Lakes in New York they're absolutely gorgeous, and so we need people to come and feel safe. But how do we do that? Cornell the Cornell Grape Program has been very helpful in that regard. They've done a lot of research. I think a lot of the way that Cornell has run their attendance in their university has sort of been, on the, I guess you could say, cutting edge of, what they think is best for one example is that they opened up their campus to full-time attendance last fall, where a lot of universities were remote. And they said they did a lot of modeling, and they thought, if we leave these kids out at their homes or wherever, they're actually more likely to spread the virus based on our modeling than if we have them on campus with, vaccination requirements, masking requirements, all this type of stuff. And we can really control their social environment. And we actually think that based on our modeling, that will reduce the spread if we have, kids on campus. So that was one thing that they did. And with us being sort of a member of the Cornell Grape Program, they do a lot of state-funded research, and they gave out a whole bunch of guidelines for, here's your tasting room, here's how you can organize your tasting room, set things up. They gave a lot of, they weren't requirements, just sort of recommendations on how we could set things up to make sure that people are, feeling comfortable and safe. But it's definitely been, I think, more challenging. I'm relatively new to the wine trail, and all that, and the wine tourism because of how young my tasting room is. But I think a lot of the bigger, more established wineries, it's been like they've had to be very dynamic in terms of how they set things up. And that's also tough when you're limiting capacity, but you'll have to like increase staff so that you have, one of the recommendations was you got stations set up. You have somebody who just does tasting, somebody who just does sales, whereas you could have it more like a waiter type of thing where one person took care of a whole group. They were recommending you set things up sort of station. Well, you got to hire more staff for that, but then you've got to limit your capacity by 50%. And it's like, the margins are already pretty thin in my industry. So it's taken a lot of adaptation, but the state has been good. We were able to get a really cheap loan that helped me get through that period. And then there's been some grants out there. I know a lot of people have utilized those they've always wanted to make a bigger tasting room with more open space, better ventilation systems. And with some state funding, they've been able to do it. So it's actually probably about as good a time, I'd say, like starting the spring, to visit this area as it's ever been, just because of how much investment and energy has been put into making this situation, safe. But like I said, it's been challenging.
Yeah. Where all do you ship to? I know you ship to Illinois.
Yes, Illinois is that's an expensive license also, but I have a very good base of friends that make it absolutely worthwhile. Ohio, I ship to, Minnesota, everywhere in Florida except 2 counties which are dry, or 3 counties, something like that are dry counties, but they're not very populated. I ship to Missouri, North Carolina.
I'm guessing not Indiana. We had blue willows until a couple of years ago.
Indiana isn't horrible. They're not terribly costly, but I only have one friend in Indiana, and the Illinois border. So I ship to a UPS station on just over the border, and he drives 15 minutes and picks it up. So,
so if people wanted to get more states on this list, they should get a group of people that say, all right, we're all going to buy.
Yeah, I mean, depending, like a state like Indiana, if I got 2 wine club members, that would probably justify it. That's kind of, but Ohio, I think I had 3 when I decided, okay, I'll do it.
All right, I'll round some people up.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So do any of our attendees have any quick questions for our guests? We don't want to take all of their time, but if anyone has a question you want to pop in, I believe several of the people on the call here have actually had Songhill wine before, so
Nice.
That's always a good thing. And I am not a big drinker of sparkly, so every time we get that, I take it to Ohio to my mom, who is, so that definitely gets a good, good audience for the sparklies. All right, well, if the attendees don't have any questions for us, then I think Jamie should ask us our favorite last question.
All right, so we like to close the episode with each of us giving our recommendations to the audience. And those recommendations can be anything from a book you've read to a song you're really enjoying or an artist you're really enjoying to your favorite museum, or I don't know, like the best Funko Pop that exists, like whatever it is you think the audience should know about. So I guess we'll start with Rebecca.
Go see The Matrix Resurrections, particularly if you saw and liked the first Matrix movie, but didn't really enjoy the second and third. This is a total redemption. It just came out today. I'm not going to do spoilers, but it is literally exactly what I wanted it to be. I'm a huge Matrix fan. this, as I mentioned, hopefully will be book 6, is about the Matrix universe. And it was all I wanted it to be and more. I came away very, very, very happy with it. I also went all out on the costume. Like I still have the colors in my hair. I've got blue ribbons on the side and red ribbons on the side. I was wearing glitter. I made a leather skirt to go to this movie premiere, and it was totally worth all of the effort. Go see The Matrix Resurrections.
Excellent. What about you, Connor?
I'm gonna recommend a book. I was trying to think, since you guys do a lot of history. One of my absolute favorite books is by an author called Norman MacLeod. He's actually most known for A River Runs Through It, because they made a movie out of it in the 90s. But he wrote a second book that was actually published after his death. They found the writings for it. It's called Young Men and Fire. It was written about a big fire that happened in 1949 in an area of the Rockies called Man Gulch, and they sent smoke jumpers down, most of them younger men, and I think 13 out of 15 of them died in the backfire. And he kind of wrote a lot, like how he felt like what happened in the aftermath of that fire was the U.S. Forest Service kind of wanted to sort of put it to rest, pretend like it didn't happen. And the parents were so kind of traumatized by their young, very like strong, vigorous, vital young men who you would kind of think at that age, in their like late teens, early 20s, were kind of the supermen of the time, dying. They were so traumatized that they didn't really want to pursue it either. And he felt like nobody really told their story. And it's I found it just very poignant, because I think he does a good job, especially by the end, of really sort of describing. He really wanted to describe, like, historically, like exactly what he thought they were going through as they were, like, fighting this fire, and then sort of being told, hey, now you got to run from this fire, which was something they were never trained on. And he talks about how some of the trainings that were the changes that were made in terms of fighting fires, big forest fires like that. And it's kind of sort of relevant to our times with climate change and a lot of forest fires going on seasonally in this day and age. So it's Young Men and Fire by Norman MacLeod.
I'll have to check that out. What about you, Kelly?
So first, I'm going to recommend everyone go get their booster shot, because this Omicron, man, it's everywhere. I'm going to recommend Song Hill wine because it is wonderful. I obviously like it since I've been drinking it for years on a regular subscription. So if you can get it, you should. But then my other recommendation, since I always recommend a book, is a book called Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. So I am not normally a reader of graphic novels. The rest of my household is. I am not. But this is I guess not a novel, graphic narrative, and it is really good. It's been on all sorts of best of lists. And I don't usually plug my other podcast on here, but next Monday on Unsung History, Dr. Rebecca Hall, who wrote Wake, is going to be my guest, and we're going to talk about it. So it's one of the things that's really great about it is the probably one of the only depictions ever in graphic form of someone doing the work of history in the archives. And she talks a lot about the challenges that she faced in the archives and the racism that she encountered in the archives. And it's really, really cool. So Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. All right, Jamie.
I teach a class on graphic novels. I will have to add that to my roster. It's
really, really good. And she, it's written for adults, but my kids have both read it. I don't think the 7-year-old got much out of it. It's really not written for him, but my 10-year-old found it really interesting. And I believe that Dr. Hall will zoom into classes. So, if you teach it, I think she'll zoom in and talk to your students.
Very nice.
All right, Jamie.
I'm also going to recommend a book. It kind of speaks to something Rebecca was talking about, but it's called Nobody's Mother, Life Without Kids. And it's this series of 21 personal essays from different women and their experiences of not having kids. And they all have different reasons for why they don't have kids. And of course, all of their experiences are different in terms of how they handle not having kids. And somebody recommended it to me because my husband and I tried for, I think, like 6 years, and it just wasn't happening. And so we made the decision together to stop trying, and we decided we like our life without kids. But we get the, when are you having kids? Why don't you want kids? Why don't you have kids yet? And a lot of it from very well-meaning people, but it's like, you know, but my parents have my brother's son, and his parents have all of his siblings' children. They're all grandparents already, so it doesn't matter if I have kids.
My parents are great grandparents now, and
wow.
I gave them a grand snake.
Mine have grandpuppies.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you guys so much for joining us. I have learned a lot. Now I know how intensive ice wine is to make. I'll be more discerning when I pick it up. So, but I hope everybody, including our audience, has a wonderful holiday season in what is probably one of the most trying holiday seasons of recent memory. I know it's hard for some people. They don't, you know, have anybody to celebrate with. So if you want to hang out with me on Twitter, I'll be around.
And we don't have an episode next week, so that means that you should go on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and just watch all of our previous episodes, and then you will have plenty to occupy you. But we will be back on January 6th, which I didn't realize until our guest that night pointed out, of course, is the anniversary of the insurrection, which we will probably have to end up talking about. But yes, we'll be back January 6th.
All right, goodbye, everybody.
All right, Happy New Year.
Thank you so much.